Hi, we're going to take a look at a problem today where you have to do all four steps for adding and subtracting rational expressions. Okay, so remember a rational expression, that's just a fraction that has variable in it. So we're talking about adding or subtracting fractions. We know the big trick with adding and subtracting fractions is that you have to get a common denominator. But there's a couple other steps too. And up until this point, we've never had a problem with all four steps. So that's what I want to do today is look at one of those problems. So let's get started. First of all, here's a reminder of what our four steps are. The first thing I want to do is factor the denominators. Then I want to get a common denominator, add and subtract my numerators, and then at the end, if it's necessary, if it's possible, I want to simplify. I will say, just so you know, that even in this week, simplifying rarely happens. It's a step that doesn't happen very often. So quite honestly, if you forget about that step, 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to be okay. But we're going to look at a problem here today where that step does come into play. Last week, we didn't really have to factor the denominators very much. We really just focused on these other two. But on this problem, we're going to have all four steps. So let's get started. Here we go. We're going to add together the fraction 4n over 6n squared plus 24n and the fraction 1 over n plus 4. Okay, so step one is I want to factor my denominators. Now, the nice thing is this denominator, that's already factored. There's nothing I can do to that. That's going to make make life nice and simple and easy. I can just focus on this thing over here. So on that thing over there, the only technique that we've learned that would work is greatest common factor. And so when I try to find the greatest common factor between 6 and 24, that common factor is going to be a 6. And the greatest common factor between n squared and n is going to be an n. So my GCF is going to be a 6n. Now, if I factor out a 6n, what's going to be left behind? Well, 6n times what equals 6n squared? That's got to be an n. And then a 6n times what would equal 24n? That's got to be a 4. Okay, so that would be the denominator. I haven't changed the numerator at all. That's still a 4n. Over here, this one didn't factor, so it stays the same. So when I'm done with step number one, this is where I'm at. This is the end of step number one. Okay. Now, I will say as a side note, depending on the textbook that you're looking at or the video that you're watching or whatever, some people would teach that you simplify this right now. And if you recognize that and you want to simplify it right now, that's totally okay. You can do that. That's just not the way that we're showing you in our class. We're talking about saving the simplification until the last step. Okay. It doesn't really matter which way. There's pros and cons to both. But I'm going to go ahead now and get my common denominator. So I can see that both of my two fractions have an n plus 4. So that's already common. I don't have to do anything else with that. That's already common. But this one has a 6n that this one is missing. So I'm going to need to multiply this thing by a 6n. And we know that anything you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top also. So what I end up with is nothing changes in this fraction. It's going to stay exactly the same. And in my other fraction, now I've got 1 times 6n. Well, that's 6n in my numerator. And then 4, or n plus 4 times 6n in the denominator. And we've talked about that we're going to just leave those in their factored form. We're not going to multiply those together. So that would be my next step. Okay. After this, we're going to add the numerators together. So that's just a combined like term step. So if I have 4 n's and someone gives me 6 more n's, all together I'm going to have a total of 10 n's. And then in the bottom, we have our common denominator. So that's the end of step number 3. So step number 1, again, just to review, factor the denominators. Step number 2, get a common denominator. Step number 3, add the numerators. And now we're on to step number 4, simplify. And remember, to simplify what we did, and we did this a couple of weeks ago, but to simplify what we did is we canceled the common factors of the top and the bottom. So in this case, I've got a 10 and a 6. Both of those can be divided by 2. So if I divide a 10 by 2, I get 5. And if I divide 6 by 2, I get a 3. So those are going to simplify. And then the top and the bottom both are multiplying with an n, so I can cancel those n's. N divided by n equals 1. So they cancel out. And what I'm left with then is in the top a 5, and in the bottom a 3 times n plus 4. Okay. Now, the other thing that we've talked about is that you do not need to distribute this. You do not need to multiply that out. In fact, it's really considered to be better this way because then it's clear and obvious to everybody that your fraction has already been simplified. And so this is our answer. Okay. And we're all set. So this is the basic idea. One more time, our 4 steps. We factor the denominators. That was the first step we did. Then we get a common denominator. That was the second step we did. Then we added the numerators. And of course, if it was a subtraction problem, then you would subtract the numerators. And then last but not least, we canceled out any common factors. And those are our 4 steps. Right? So I hope this helps. Most of the problems that you're going to see even this week will only have 3 out of the 4 steps. It's rare that you get this 4th one, but just in case it comes up, you've got an example of that. So good luck with your problems this week. As always, if you run into any issues, any problems, feel free to shoot an email, let us know, but hopefully this will get you started. Thanks for watching.